Okay, I'm Thorin Tritter. I am the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, located in lovely Wellwind Preserve in Glen Cove, New York, although currently closed because of the corona crisis. And so we're providing our programs online like this one. Before I start talking today about our other topics of bagels and bialys, I wanted to just put in an advertisement here and invite you to join me for some of our other upcoming programs, including this coming Sunday's HMTC's annual Yom HaShoah program. Next Wednesday, I'll be leading one of our weekly Curators Corners, talking in particular about a children's book in our collection. And on Sunday, April 26th, please join me for our commemorative program about the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau. You can find more information about these programs and how to register for them, along with a full list of our calendar of events, on our events tab on our website, www.hmtcli.org. Okay, so today I'm going to speak about the bagel and the bialy. As many of you know, the Jewish holiday of Passover, when many Jews do not eat bread or other leavened foods, ends tonight. And so it seems like a particularly appropriate time to talk about the lovely, chewy, and soft bagel and its cousin, the bialy, that will be returning to many breakfast tables tomorrow morning. Before I go on, I want to say to encourage you to write your questions, if you have them during the talk, in the chat window, which you should be able to find if you scroll your mouse along the bottom of the portion of the screen. Just type your question into the chat window. I'll try and answer it either while I'm giving my presentation or at the end of the program. Okay, back to the bagel and the bialy. You may, of course, be wondering why the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center would be presenting a program on bagels and bialys. And the answer is that these two iconic foods have their roots in the Jewish communities of Central Europe, which were devastated by the Holocaust. Both foods came to America decades before the rise of Hitler, brought by Jewish immigrants who settled here at the end of the 19th century. In the wake of the Holocaust, they can be seen as two remnants of the Yiddish-speaking world that was largely destroyed by the Holocaust. So every time we enjoy a bagel or bialy, we're enjoying some part of that rich Jewish culture of pre-war Europe. With that said, the history of the bialy is clearer than that of the history of the bagel. If you're not familiar with the bialy, that's certainly understandable. It's not as popular. Oops, I seem to have lost my camera. Not sure why. I hope you can still see my screen. Helen, it looks like maybe you've logged in and your camera is shared. I'm not sure why that's going on. Well, I will keep going. Oh, there we go. Sorry for that little problem, snafu. Anyway, I was just talking about why you might not be familiar you might not be familiar with the bialy, but that's because it's just not as popular as the bagel. The bagel and the bialy are certainly similar. Bialy is round like the bagel, similar dough. There are, however, four important differences, the four no's of the bialy. Most obviously, it doesn't have a hole. Instead, it is filled with onions and can be with other toppings. It also is not boiled like a bagel. Instead, the water never touches the bialy, it's just baked. Purists also say that bialy dough is a bit different from bagel dough, having more yeast, which makes for a faster rise and a softer ridge, and no sugar or malt, which is often included in the bagel dough to make it shiny and crusty. The bialy also never caught on in the same way as the bagel. The word bialy is a hint to its history. The bialy is also known as in longer form as the Bialystoker Kuchen, or bread from Bialystok, a city in what's now eastern Poland, but in the 19th century was part of Tsarist Russia. While there are competing claims about who invented the bialy, it appears that it was developed by Jewish bakers in Bialystok in the 19th century. A related bread remains popular in Eastern Europe today, referred to in Polish as the cebuash, and known as a specialty of Lublin, a city 150 miles south of Bialystok, also very close to the border with Belarus. Here's one example from just a quick Google search I did for cebuash, and you can see the similarity to the bialy. Bialys, of course, arrived in New York in the late 19th century when immigrants from Bialystok settled on the Lower East Side and started baking their traditional bread. Perhaps the best sign of that Bialystoker community on the Lower East Side is the Bialystoker Synagogue, which was originally founded in 1865 on Hester Street, but moved in 1905 to this impressive building on Willett Street, just south of the entrance to the Williamsburg Bridge. Another sign of the Bialystok community in the Lower East Side is Kosar's Bialys, which was founded in 1836 and known into the 1960s by its longer name, Kosar's Bialystoker Kuchen Bakery. A lone holdout of what was once a much larger industry, Kosar's is still around and means you can go down to the Lower East Side tomorrow, and find a hot bialy much like those made 100 years ago in Bialystok. The bagel is, of course, available far and wide today. Its roots are somewhat older and somewhat less clear than the bialy, but whereas the bialy never really caught on outside of New York, the bagel eventually found much broader appeal. The bagel is distinctive because of its chewiness and soft inside, created by rich gluten flour, a long and slow proofing at cool temperatures, referred to as, in baking terms, as retardation, and then the process of both boiling and baking. Boiling also has the benefits of firming up the shape so that the bagel retains its circular form in baking and helps to give the bagel a glossy crust. There is a common referenced legend that says the bagel was invented by Viennese bakers in honor of the Polish king Jan Sobieski, who saved Austria from Turkish invaders at the Battle of Vienna in 1683. To thank the king, who was known as a great horseman and who led the massive cavalry charge that broke the Ottoman forces in 1683, a cavalry charge, by the way, of about 18,000 horses, that's frequently noted as the largest cavalry attack in history. But to thank the Polish king, bakers made the bread in the shape of a stirrup and named it the Bagel, a shortened form of the German word for stirrup, Steigbügel. And indeed, if you look for paintings or images of the Battle of Vienna, including this one by the Polish artist Jerzy Jemianowski, King Jan Sobieski is depicted on horseback, standing up in stirrups. Sadly, there are references to the bagel that predate the Battle of Vienna in 1683, and even the birth of Jan Sobieski in 1629. So the stirrup idea, while appealing, has some problems as the real origin for the word bagel. Alan Davidson, who wrote the highly regarded Oxford Companion to Food, claimed that the word bagel arose from the Yiddish bagel, itself taken from the German word bugle, but not as a shortened form of stirrup, but rather because it means ring or bracelet. One other explanation comes from Joan Nathan, the author of Jewish Cooking in America, who says the word bagel is not from bugle, but from the German word begen, to bend. Whatever the word comes from, the origins of the bagel are likely related to the origins of a number of other circular breads and rolls that were made in Europe and elsewhere far before the 1680s. The Lebanese krak, for example, has a similar shape, as does the northern Italian ciambelli, or the southern Italian tirali, or the Uyghur gurd. Also similar is the Greek kolori and the Finnish vesirnikeli. It's not clear how or if these different breads are related. Did the tarali or the gird give rise to the bagel as Jewish traders trekked along the old Silk Road? That's certainly possible. Or perhaps it came by way of Germany. German monks in the 1200s gave a bread referred to in Latin as a bracellae, that is the same Latin root for the English word bracelet, and which the Germans later changed with a few twists to bretzel and later pretzel. We do know that the first recorded mention of the Jewish bagel comes from Krakow in 1610 in Poland, when the Jewish Council of Krakow passed a series of sumptuary laws that limited consumption of certain products, partially to prevent envy among Gentile neighbors and partly to prevent poor Jews from spending beyond their means. One of the sumptuary laws in 1610 specifically dealt with who may send for bagels, as well as cakes and challah, Jewish bread, to celebrate the circumcision of a baby boy. It's unclear from the wording if the law was meant to limit the consumption of bagels just to brisses, or if it was meant to limit the foods that could be served at a bris to just bagels, cakes, and challah. Some have claimed that the law shows that the bagel was a food given to women at the time of childbirth, but that seems like a rather bit of a stretch of an interpretation of the information we have. Regardless, we know that by 1610, the bagel was well known in Krakow, that it was seen as needing some kind of regulation by Jewish elders. We also know it was a specialty item, at least initially, and not something one ate every day. It's likely, however, that there was an intermediate step between some of these other European circular rolls and the Polish bagel of 1610. One likely predecessor is a Polish bread from Krakow called the obwarzhanek, or obwarzhanek krakowski. This is a bread that you can see today sold all over Krakow in stalls like these, and they look a lot like a bagel. Like the bagel, the obwarzhanek is baked as well as boiled. Indeed, the word obwarzhanek derives from the Polish word to parboil. However, it is notably larger than a bagel and has a different texture with a much harder and crisper crust. The first mention of the obwarzhanek dates from 1394 and is seen in accounts from the Polish royal households. According to these early texts, the bread was made specifically for the Polish queen Jadwiga during Lent, when it was seen as a less luxurious bread than others that were made with fats. Whether the bagel arrived in Krakow from elsewhere by Jewish immigrants, or if it was developed in Krakow by Jewish residents, it seems clear that by 1610, it was a food that competed directly with the older obwarzhanek. Over the next 200 years, both the bagel and the obwarzhanek remained centered in Krakow, remained specialty items rather than everyday foods, and remained separated along religious lines, with the bagel eaten only by the Jewish community. By the middle of the 19th century, rising wheat production in Poland, combined with imported wheat from the United States, reduced the cost of flour, white flour in particular, and thus increased the availability of the bagel. And so it was over the course of the 19th century, relatively recently, that the bagel went from a rare treat to a commonly eaten bread in Poland. Regardless of the growing availability of bagels, bagel making was seen as particularly difficult and dirty work, as it required not only working with a very tough dough, the highly glutinous bagel dough, but also because the work involved maintaining an oven. In the winter, working in front of an oven might have been nice, but in the summer it was hot work. More difficult was the cleaning out of the ashes, the getting wood, the stoking the fire, and the maintaining of a regular temperature. And given that bagels have an appealing shelf life of only about 5 hours before they get stale and hard, bagel bakers generally worked long hours to produce bagels on a regular schedule and had to get them out and sold quickly. Adding According to some of the records, and some of you may be familiar with this term, there was a common exhortation, go bake bagels, in the 19th century in Poland, which was a curse, not a blessing. The bagel also started to spread beyond just the Jewish consumers in Poland by the early 20th century. We know that a dictionary from the early 20th century in Poland included the word bagel, suggesting that the word was in common circulation, and defined it as a Jewish obwarzhanek, so sustaining that division between these two breads. The bagel really took off in the early 20th century in the wake of World War I, when Poland was reborn as a new republic and was led by Józef Piłsudski, who opposed anti-Semitism and emphasized a broad Polish nationalism. By the mid-1920s, bagels were available on street corners in almost every Polish town, sold mostly by Jewish peddlers, but consumed by people of every ethnicity and class. With Piłsudski's death in 1935 and the joint Nazi and Soviet invasions in 1935, life for Jews in Poland became a terror. As we well know, by 1945, the Nazis had killed more than 90% of Polish Jews, more than 3 million Polish Jews. The rich Jewish culture in Poland was largely destroyed with those murders. However, the culture survived in places where Jewish emigres had moved before the war, most notably New York, where the Lower East Side became a hub of Jewish life beginning in the 1880s and 1890s. And that is exactly where the bagel got its start in America, although the exact timing, the exact location, we don't know. We do know that by 1891, guidebooks referred to bagels as commonplace, cheap food available in the Lower East Side, and something that new immigrants could sell on the street for cheaper prices than in Poland. By 1900, there were 70 bakeries in the Lower East Side, most of which were selling bagels as part of their repertoire. One of the interesting stories about the bagel in New York is actually about its part in labor organizing. Bagel baking remained a difficult job even in the early 20th century. And the combination, in fact, most of the baking ovens on the Lower East Side were located below street level, centered on Hester Street and Rivington Street, home of the big pushcart markets. Poor ventilation and rudimentary ovens in these subterranean spaces meant the temperatures in the working area were fierce. Most bagel bakers worked stripped to the waist for 13 and 14 hours a day, and they were paid by the piece, by the amount of bagels they produced. The poor working conditions, along with the reformist spirit of the early 20th century, led in 1908 to the formation of a Jewish bakers' union on the Lower East Side. Local 100 of the Bakery and Confectioners Workers International Union of America. Here's a picture of their label that shows the big paddles used to move bread in and out of the wood-fired ovens. Jewish bagel bakers eventually separated off from Local 100 in the 1930s when some 300 bakers created Local 338, known as the Bagel Bakers Union. And you can see a card showing their earlier spelling for bagel. The union was led by a group of old Yiddish-speaking bagel bakers who were the bosses of the bagel world. They kept a tight lid on the recipe for bagels, working to prevent anyone other than its members from knowing how to make bagels. They also strictly limited who could be a bagel baker, limiting membership to the sons, nephews, and other relatives of current members of the union. And they also maintained high standards. Bloodlines were not enough to be a bagel baker. To be allowed into the union as a full member, bakers needed to show they could hand roll over 800 bagels per hour. Local 338 remained strong into the 1950s and 60s, assuring that its workers, while paid by the piece, were earning some of the highest salaries in the industry. In 1960, bagel bakers were making more than most policemen or teachers in New York City. The key reason for their high pay was the difficulty of creating a machine to mass produce bagels and the continued reliance on handmade bagels. While other breads had become mass-produced through automated machinery, bagels remained handmade because of the thick and tough dough. There were references before mechanized mixing machines to how bagel bakers would knead the dough with their legs and feet because it was so heavy and thick. Regardless of the success of bagel bakers and their union, through the 1950s, bagels remained largely a Jewish food in America that was only common in the New York City area. In March of 1950, the Bakers and Confectioners Union produced its magazine with a cover story about the bagel. This was a magazine that was disseminated across the country to bakers. But the writers knew that many would never have heard of what they described as a Jewish bread shaped like a donut. The article opened with this description. Walking into a bagel bakery gives you the feeling that you are entering another century. The air is thick with the flavor of the old world because modernism has no place in an establishment which produces this ancient Jewish bread product. A film made by the Brooklyn Public Library in the 1970s captures the old world skills of bagel baking even then. And I'm going to try and play just a 2-minute clip of that video.
The process of making bagels, you have to put flour in, add wall, salt, and we put pails of water in. And in the water, we put the yeast in. We mix the yeast by hand, and the machine starts running about a half hour. By that time, all of the work is done, all the processing is done, and then we take the dough out. When we take the dough out, we put it on a table. This is cornmeal. We put it on here so the bagels won't stick. Then we start cutting it like this. We get it down firm, and then we start making strips. Now we start making the bagels. I guess everybody knows bagels in New York are just one of these things that go together. As where if you go outside of New York, a lot of places don't even know what a bagel is. From what I understand, I think the reason for that is the water in New York. There's something in the water that does it. These bagels are much better than the machine maker, but this is a handmade bagels. There's a better taste to a handmade bagel than a machine. Each bagel that I'm making now should weigh approximately about 4 ounces, 4.5 ounces, right around there. On a board like this, you put them down, 7 down, 5 across, 35 bagels on a board. And a dough around the size of this, you should get about 90 to 100 dozen out of it.
Wait for the pot to boil.
I love that video. You can really see how bagel making hadn't changed very much from the 19th century or even maybe from the 1600s until the 1970s, where you've got these guys hand rolling this huge piece of dough into small bagels and seemingly effortlessly. I'm guessing that guy could do 600 to 800 bagels an hour. Several innovations changed the old world of bagel baking in the 1960s and 70s, undermining Local 338, but at the same time bringing bagels to a much wider audience. The changes were nothing short of revolutionary, and the leader of that revolution was Harry Lender. Harry Lender was a bagel baker in Poland who came to New York in 1927. After working for a bagel baker in New Jersey, he moved to New Haven in 1928 in Connecticut and established the New York Bagel Bakery, one of the first bagel bakeries in the United States to be opened outside of New York City, or at least the metro area. By the 1950s, his success was causing him problems. While the weekday demand was small, he found that his bagel bakery would sell between 3,000 and 6,000 dozen bagels on the weekends. This was not mostly to walk-in customers, but to delis, hotels, and other big customers. His son Murray, who later ran the business, said, "All hell broke loose from Saturday morning until Sunday. It was a 24-hour stretch where we did nothing but work." Unable to maintain that level of production just on the weekend, Harry Lender bought a freezer, and by 1954 had come up with a way to freeze bagels made during the week and then defrost them before he delivered them to his customers on the weekend without having them realize that anything was being done differently. Eventually, some of the undefrosted bagels got delivered and word got out that he was freezing them, but by then his customers were satisfied with the product and didn't raise a complaint. The Lender family also started selling their frozen bagels to grocery stores that catered to non-Jewish audiences. And here Lender offered a new flavor of bagel to appeal to someone who had never tasted one before. He based the new flavor on other popular breakfast breads like danishes or coffee cake, and the cinnamon raisin bagel was born, something the old bosses of Local 338 would have seen as heresy. In 1959, 50% of Lender's sales were to supermarkets. He was succeeding at taking the ethnicity out of the bagel and making it something non-Jews and Jews alike would enjoy. But Lender's bagels were still made by hand into the 1960s. In the following year, Harry Lender passed away in 1961, and his son Sam and Murray continued the business. In 1963, after working with an inventor in California named Daniel Thompson, Lenders put into use the first commercially successful automated bagel making machine. Instead of making 600 to 800 bagels per hour like a skilled bagel baker, the machine could produce almost 5,000 bagels an hour. Lender's Bagels also pioneered one more innovation. After getting letters and lawsuits from consumers who cut their fingers on the defrosted but still clammy and slippery bagel, Sam and Murray Lender introduced a slicing machine into their production line and started flash freezing pre-sliced bagels. In 1964, Lenders moved to a new facility in West Haven, where they ramped up production even more. 6 years later, sales were over $2.25 million, and they had gained contracts with places like Howard Johnson and the US military that served a much broader audience than just the Jewish community. Sales continued to grow over the next couple of years, and by 1977, Lenders could claim that its bagels were being sold nationwide. By 1984, the company that had 6 employees 20 years earlier had grown to 600 employees and had sales near $65 million a year. In that same year, Murray and Sam Lender sold the business to Kraft Foods, the makers of Philadelphia cream cheese, a sale that was promoted as a marriage made in heaven. One Kraft survey in 1984 found that 80% of Americans had yet to taste a bagel, suggesting a large untapped market that was still out there. But Harry and his sons had broken through the historical image of the bagel as a particularly Jewish food. Lenders has gone through several other ownership changes since 1984, but today Lenders bagels are made in the biggest bagel factory in the world, located in Mattoon, Illinois, suggesting the national demand for bagels that can most easily be met by a factory in the middle of the country. Let me finish with one final comment about the bagel and the bialy and their journey. In the 1990s, Bagel, a famous bakery in Warsaw, reintroduced the bagel to its menu, bringing it back to city residents for the first time since the end of World War II. A few years later, in 2001, an American who had moved to Krakow, Poland, opened Bagelmama, reintroducing the bagel to that city where it had originated back in the 17th century. It was the first bagel bakery in Krakow in nearly 50 years. These reintroductions were both ironic and symbolic. Eastern European Jews who came to America in the late 19th century brought their culture across the Atlantic with them. their religion, their music, their language, and their foods. In New York, those immigrants settled in large part in the Lower East Side, where life was not always great, but where the Yiddish-speaking culture of Eastern Europe took root. As the decades passed, the descendants of those early immigrants spread outwards from the Lower East Side, bringing Jewish culture to Harlem, the Bronx, Brooklyn, out into Long Island and other suburbs, and then westward. While American Jewry thrived, European Jewry suffered through the rise of Hitler and the Holocaust. 6 million Jews murdered, flourishing Jewish communities destroyed. In places like Warsaw and Krakow, the bagel and other evidence of Jewish culture faded out. But the rich Jewish culture of Eastern Europe was kept alive, sustained by American Jews who were the children of the immigrants who'd come over in the 1890s and early 1900s. The founders of synagogues across the country can trace their family histories back through New York and Ellis Island. Similarly, many of the melodies and music heard in those synagogues or in Jewish community centers trace back to the Eastern Europe history. And in food, it's no different. Bagels, bialys, babka, brisket, even foods that don't begin with B, like kugel, rugelach, latkes, cholent. These are foods eaten across America that trace their roots back to the Jewish Lower East Side and other immigrant communities that emerged in America in the early part of the 20th century and the late 19th century. And now the remnant of the Yiddish-speaking culture that settled in America 130 years ago is bringing that culture back to Europe. It's almost like coming a full circle, or much like the bagel itself. I'll stop there. I hope that you enjoyed learning a little about the history of the bagel and the bialy. I want to again encourage you to attend some of our other future online programs, including the upcoming Yom HaShoah program this coming Sunday. And I ask you to spend a minute and support HMTC, the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, by making a donation on our website. I'm not sure that through this shared format I can actually give you the link, but you can find it at www.hmtcli.org and just click Give Now. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but thanks very much for participating. Enjoy the end of Passover and enjoy your bagel and bialy tomorrow.